And now, to kick off 2 wonderful days of engaging discussion, I will turn the attention of our audience in Chicago and online to the session entitled Inflection Points in Ethical Design. We have Gabriela Richard from Penn State University and Marcos Moldez, who is joining us courtesy of Pinterest. And we have exciting presentations here for you today. I will ask Gabriela Richard to come and share with us her thoughts.
Thank you so much for this gracious invitation. I am humbled to be kicking off the sessions today. So I'm going to start with a talk about multimodal technologies, emerging digital ecologies, and ethics, implications, possibilities, and critical futures. So I'm going to be talking very broadly, maybe not so much about chatbots and AI, but more so about the ecosphere and the emerging and evolving spaces as different media and technologies converge. So the focal points of my talk today are I'm first going to define what I mean by multimodal technologies and emerging ecologies. And then I'm going to really emphasize my stance, which is that education is broader than formal education. And a lot of my talk really emphasizes this idea about enculturation and sociocultural learning that happens throughout our lives and increasingly in digitized and technology mediated spaces. And then I'll talk about ethical issues in the design of media and technology and research-informed possibilities. So first, what I mean by multimodality really comes from the communication space. So thinking about modes, images, linguistic usage, writing is often emphasized, but that meaning is shaped socially and culturally and semiotically, that there are these intrinsic values and elements that we may not always be aware of. But as multimodal technologies start to converge, so we have this increasing ecosphere of different technologies, and they're not independent anymore. They're often imbued, they're used together, they're used to parse out information in different ways, in different contexts, sometimes to take multiple media sources and align them together, but oftentimes they're influencing each other all at once. So if we think about AI and how much predictive modeling is undergirding a lot of the technologies and the design media around us, including surveillance technologies, there really is a convergence that's happening at multiple layers. And then when we think about multimodality, we also think about convergence, as I talked about before, and this idea that I really borrow from Henry Jenkins, which is user-generated content that exists both within and outside of commercial contexts and supports as well as subverts corporate control. However, at the same time, these new media configurations really exert an impact on media law, economics, aesthetics, politics, and labor. And within that is participatory culture. So the ways that we're participating and interacting with and consuming media in different ways. Yet each of us construct our own personal sense of the meaning of the technologies that we're consuming. Now, I really take this ecological view of learning through the social world. So I'm a learning scientist. I'm somebody who's trained in media studies, but I'm somebody who really occupies the world of education. And I like to think about education as lifelong and life-wide, borrowing from the Life Center. And this idea that we are constantly engaging in informal learning, especially now in the digitally mediated age. I also borrow a lot from Mimi Ito and colleagues' work along the lines of connected learning. This whole idea that young people in particular, so they really emphasize young people, but this is really, I also emphasize adults because we're always learning and growing and engaging. In fact, Pew recently issued a report that more people are learning from YouTube than other sources, particularly in their out-of-school time. So connected learning really underscores this idea of building more diverse entry points and pathways. So it really takes this optimistic view of the ways that people learn with media and technology. And it also builds from communities of practice, which is this idea that knowledge occurs in authentic contexts where knowledge can be applied, and that there's a shared domain of practice. And increasingly, a lot of that is happening online in different communities and spaces. Sometimes people are joining those spaces more formally and less formally, often as peripheral learners who then become more central in the space. But at the same time, there are influences and critiques. So if we think about semiotics, throughout our lives, we are influenced by symbolic representation. But very, very few of us are actually formally educated around semiotics. So we don't really have a sense of how to fully understand the way that images, iconography, other symbols are affecting us. Now, at the same time, participatory culture has become an increasing part of our lives, especially young people's lives. And generally, we think about it as this democratizing force, but it has a lot of problems embedded in it, particularly around flattening complexity of discourse and deep understanding. And yet so much, particularly of young people's lives, is influenced by participatory culture and the ways that they're creating content, being influenced by influencers, and then also themselves thinking about that content within that space and that influence of others that are creating things, often for commercial intent that they may not always understand. So an example from games as learning ecologies is this whole idea that, we have different theorists who talk about different aspects of learning from games. And one idea comes from Jim G, which is that games offer the possibility to engage with these projective identities, which are new values and ways of being in the world based on powerful juxtaposition to their real world. So being able to try on these different roles through games. But at the same time, Lisa Nakamura brings up the dangers of identity tourism, which is a real problem when we're thinking about media that has very problematized depictions around gender, race, culture, sexuality, sexual identity. And Anna Everett and Craig Watkins also bring up this idea, particularly within racialized depictions of racialized pedagogical zones, this idea that gameplay's pleasure principles of mastery and winning are often tied to and defined by familiar racial and ethnic stereotypes. Now that becomes particularly true when we think about historic problems of representation in video games. That playable characters are overwhelmingly, when they are discernible as humanoid, they're overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male, and that women and girls and people of color are more likely to be secondary or non-playable characters, so not really having agency. And that there's also these historic problems, not only in commercial games, but also in educational games. And then even within our scholarly work, until more recently, there have been historic problems around intersectional scholarship. So a lot of what we looked at was gender in this very monolithic way that often privileged white women, as opposed to looking at these intersectional experiences across race, sexuality, and culture. So when we think about that within the lens of participatory culture, we understand that there's this problem that participants are expected to interact with each other according to a new set of rules, which nobody fully understands. And yet again, we each personalize our own sense of the meaning that we're making from these different representations without that real understanding, that real education around how to consume these symbols. So as part of that, one of the outgrowths was Gamergate in 2014, more acutely, which was referenced a little bit earlier today. So Gamergate happened in 2014, and it was really this directed attack primarily at women who were journalists, as well as developers and players. And at the time, they tried to claim that this was really about games journalism. So it was really like this attempt at subterfuge to really change the discourse and the understanding about what the intent was. But since then, there have been plenty of studies, and at the time, there were even media articles that were looking at and trying to understand the types of tweets and different social media that was coming out, and found that it was primarily about harassment of women in these spaces. And at the same time, many years later, we started to see that a lot of these themes that happened during Gamergate, the ways that young people were consuming and thinking about culture and identity, were also tied to some of the themes around Gamergate. So a lot of the iconography was co-opted in ways that people didn't fully understand, but became insider speak, and later was co-opted by the alt-right. So I have an example here of Pepe the Frog, who was kind of like this insider character in a not very well-known comic book series by Matt Fury called The Boys Club. And then it was rebranded in these alt-right iconography, and then later co-opted in a less hateful way, but still symbolizing some of those implicit values. So The Guardian did a really good piece on this in 2016, talking about different people who had embraced Gamergate and how they didn't always understand all of the various messages that were being transmitted through Gamergate. And some were actually confused about those messages, but it still had this effect of indoctrinating people to certain ideas that ended up being exclusionary and hateful, primarily to the most minoritized and vulnerable groups. Now, here's an example of how Pepe the Frog became his own symbol that a lot of people didn't fully understand and started to embrace in online live streaming culture. And this is an example of a third-party piece of software that's used to embed certain emotes or emoticons in Twitch that are not necessarily authorized by Twitch, but are prevalently used. And this particular emote is of Pepe the Frog, and not necessarily in a hateful way, but because of those like implicit ideas around Pepe and his associations, it became later associated with exclusionary practices. And on the left is an example of Terrence M., who was at the time the only Black player of a major competitive game, Hearthstone. And during a tournament, people were using an icon of a popular streamer, one of the only Black icons, as a means of trying to subject him to racist abuse. Now, again, if you just kind of look at this and you see a lot of images of a Black man's face, you may not necessarily understand the symbolic representation with hate, but these are the various ways people have used images and symbols to create a culture around who belongs and who does not. And on the right is an example of Ms. Ash Rocks, a Black woman streamer who was explicitly targeted for racist abuse, but she used both Twitch as well as Twitter as a means of multimodally expressing her experience of being targeted for racist abuse online. This also translates in a lot of ways to the lack of diversity that we see in live streaming content creators who are overwhelmingly male and white. So not only is there exclusion, but the continued disenfranchisement of certain players as being agentic in the space is inexorably linked. And a lot of that had to do with underlying algorithms in Twitch, which they have since started to address to try to promote more minoritized streamers, but still part of the problem of these algorithms of oppression, as Sophia Noble would say. So there really is this relationship not only around the different ways that media converge and historic inequalities, but also the ways they feed into STEM cultures of learning and production. So as an example, oftentimes there's this perception that there aren't enough degree holders of color from minoritized groups in STEM fields that are comparable to work in tech. But in actuality, we see that despite having similar degree attainment, people of color, and in particular, Black and Latinx women, are greatly underrepresented in the field. Now, one way to look at this is this overwhelming practice in tech of taking this content agnostic approach, that this idea that the designs that we create are value free, but that really divorces us from really understanding the biases that we all bring and the ways that we're influenced by culture, both explicitly and implicitly. So scholars Lachney, Babbitt, and Ron Englash, put forth this idea that the content agnostic position really ignores the ways that commercialized products, advertisement, and media commodities put forth these various ideas that still influence the kinds of designs people can create. And they were talking in particular about the designs that are meant for youth to learn how to code and create their own digital media and share them online, but that those media have similar problems of a lack of representation. So what they found were these themes where children using Scratch, which is considered like the YouTube of content creation, programming, and learning digital media design, were creating mainly commercialized products, just recreating them as opposed to fostering this new space for design. And in an analysis that I did with Yasmin Kafai, we actually found that of those that did disclose, particularly from minoritized backgrounds, that there was active dismissal or a lack of awareness of racial realities in the types of discourse that would happen online. There was a lack of disclosure of cultural background, in part because I think a lot of scratchers of color realized that they may not be supported, and a lack of projects with diverse themes. So we saw similar things as our other colleagues. So this really feeds into this idea of the ways that the underlying algorithms and the designs in our technology and media really reinforce these values and worldviews. And that there really needs to be more of an emphasis on the humanities and the social sciences, particularly in our STEM programs and in the ways that we're fostering understanding in tech. That design is not just about the technical skills, but it's also about understanding the values that we're embedding. And this is particularly important, again, when we start thinking about the ways that technologies are designed, particularly AI, around surveillance, particularly because there was such a strong design deficit that really put people at risk for policing or just being completely misidentified. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some possibilities for inclusive and transformative design. Now, I work a lot with young people, and I teach them how to create not only their own interactive multimedia, but also thinking about physical designs, so engineering designs. So it's not just the digital media, but also the physical media. How can they learn with multiple media sources and to think about the symbolic representations, but also those embedded values? So in our research, we find that it's really important if we want to create inclusive spaces that we are engaging with culturally relevant pedagogy, funds of knowledge, really thinking about models that bring people's values into the space and encourage them to think about their own cultures as they're designing, particularly cultures that are not as well represented in a lot of our commercialized designs. And the research has found that when you embed different types of tools and technologies as part of these educational experiences, that it changes the way that gendered and sociocultural interests are expressed. So one example is working with electronic textiles. So electronic textiles use similar kinds of microcontroller technology as like Arduino. They just happen to use sewable microcontrollers. And by using something that has such an implicit value that's tied to gendered values around sewing and design, which are also often thought to be women or girls' skills, it changes already the dynamic because it has those stereotypes associated. So how do we think about how to hack the stereotypes in positive ways? Another thing to consider is how we're promoting these types of STEM learning activities. So being really intentional about having content-aware promotional materials that encourage diversity in the ways that we're advertising these opportunities, but also having counter-stereotypical mentors as well as learners prominent in the space. Actively recruiting people from underrepresented groups, ongoing encouragement, really emphasizing learning as opposed to this idea that there's a fixed mindset that only some people know how to do things, making sure the space is accessible, educate all involved about a lot of these issues, these embedded issues, taking culturally sustaining approaches that really empower students to have agency, connecting learning to histories and practices, encouraging connections to learners' funds of knowledge, particularly when they're from non-dominant groups, because there's often this perception that, particularly in Black and Brown communities, that they don't have or have not contributed to innovation, which we know is completely false. So one of the studies I've done is a design-based research study, understanding the kinds of outreach programs that I run, which is really, again, it's integrated design, both physical and digital. And I call it bidirectionally responsive design. It models complex embedded and hybrid systems design, but utilizes simplified digital and physical toolkits like maker tools to fabricate, and learners learn how to fabricate simultaneously digital and physically responsive systems. So they learn how to code, they learn how to create these interactive wearables with conductive materials. They're thinking about embodiment, materiality. They're really thinking about the designs of everyday systems around them, including controllers, like game controllers, as well as maybe Fitbits and Apple Watches. So they learn how to code and do media design in Scratch. In the past, we worked with the Makey, which is a plug and play friendly physical computing device that makes anything with a little bit of conductivity into a controller. They learned how to work with electronic textiles. So again, the sewable microcontrollers. They also learned how to program those. I used a particular environment in the past called ModKit. I use a new one now. And they would create these interactive systems that were both physically responsive and digitally responsive. So they have to think through all of those design decisions, but also understand what's embedded in the design practices. And in 2019, we integrated a new toolkit. So they worked together to create these different prototypes, which are like buildable models of the curriculum that model the types of practices they would have to engage in, and then they come up with their own personally meaningful projects together. So in small groups of 2 or 3 people. And in 2019, I introduced the Circuit Playground because it has its own online integrated development environment, which is block-based and pretty easy for people to learn. It also has sensors and actuators integrated on the board. It's also a sewable microcontroller from Adafruit. And it allowed for multiple sensory inputs beyond touch, so they could really think through those design decisions and understand them at a deeper level. We used audio and video observations as well as surveys to understand their shifts in self-perceptions and agency. I use Robinson's computational thinking survey, which really helps to understand those shifts. And it considers things such as self-efficacy beliefs around being able to create things with computers, know how a computer works abstractly, analyzing problems and artifacts, collaborating, communicating, being able to tell others how a computer works, and connecting, having an impact on the way people live with computers. And they're really integrated around these ideas about self-efficacy beliefs, not just practices in computer science, but also beliefs. And what we found is with the older set of tools, collaborating, abstracting, and developing computational artifacts was significant for the learners, in part because of the ways that they had to work together with the tools to create their designs. It was more of like a workaround. Whereas in the second cohort, when they were working with the Circuit Playground, which allowed them to really think deeper and have these multiple connections, connecting computing was more significant. And again, connecting computing is that whole idea of having an impact on the way that people live with computers and using computers to help people. So those self-efficacy beliefs. And I have a couple of case studies, which actually shows that they engaged in all of these practices, even though some were more salient for the different cohorts. So in 2018, they engaged in similar practices around abstracting and modularizing, analyzing problems and artifacts, communicating, collaborating, and developing computational artifacts. They also were thinking more meaningfully about computing in their lives and STEM in their lives. Even if they chose not to do something in STEM, they had a more pragmatic reason why they would or would not, so they could now articulate that. And in the 2019 cohort, they also created integrated systems, but they had to work a little bit harder to collaborate together because so much of what they could do, they could now do on their own. But again, they engage in all these practices, even with these other tools. So in the end, by using these simplified digital and physical tools to create content and different integrated technologies, we found that learners were challenged to engage in considerations that would extend beyond the use of the tools themselves. So they were really thinking deeply and meaningfully about the use of these tools and technologies, and that they helped to foster inclusive collaborative practices. We again saw those gendered shifts. Initially, they might come in with these stereotypes, but by the end, they were doing counter stereotypical work. So for example, boys were more likely to do the sewing and girls were more likely to do the coding. The applications were authentic to practice and understanding complex systems. And learners from groups historically underrepresented expressed stronger shifts in computational concepts, self-efficacy, and identification. So generally, a concluding argument is that being able to design these systems really helps learners understand the design of these different technologies in the world around them, and to think more meaningfully and deeply and critically about the ways that they are designed and how they can have an impact on transformative approaches. There are also promising directions with narrative approaches such as restoring, which Mia Shah, Yasmin Kafai, and colleagues have taken up. And it's this idea of really putting Black womanist practices central to the design process and really integrating them directly and meaningfully as part of the curriculum and design process for innovative and transformative design. In some of my other work, I've found that a lot of the same patterns, the work that I've done with Jooyoung Seo, who's one of my students and is now actually a professor in his own right at UIC. We found that actually the ways that you would design technologies for greater equity and inclusivity also align with universal design practices, so creating greater accessibility. And we came up with this intersectional accessibility framework for research and design that is considering not only intersectional approaches, but also the ways that designs can be more accessible. So the use of multiple modalities, equitable and inclusive learning, so designing learning environments that are more integrated, and allowing learners to create multiple and participatory designs. So in the end, we have to think about the materiality of engagement and the affordances of different technologies and media, and connect participatory STEM cultures and learners' everyday lives so that they can better think through, dissect, and understand the influences that they are being they're mediating as they're navigating the space. And some of the current and future work that I'm doing right now is working in particular with different groups that bring Black and Brown women together, not only as consumers and live streamers, but also as people that are trying to encourage more adoption and understanding in STEM. And building critical consciousness and design through targeted interventions, as well as making these experiences learner-centered and community-centered. So thank you so much for your time, and I will let the next person speak. Thank you.